Okay, so let's just take a look at the review for the weekend project. Um, One of the things that I think we're going to find out is that the uh, React itself is fairly simplistic in that it really only ends up dealing with rendering the DOM, and it renders it very well, does that very well. But everything sort of outside of that, there's a whole React ecosystem. So one thing to sort of just keep in mind if you end up looking at some other frameworks, for instance, with the framework that I tend to work with during the day when I do consulting, and also the framework that we used to end up teaching here was something called Angular. And Angular was a much more robust framework in the sense that you didn't necessarily have to bring in your own routing. You didn't have to, we're going to end up bringing in Redux, which is something that you didn't really necessarily have to do with Angular. So as we go on through this Juke workshop, we're going to see different libraries that we're sort of bringing in. And again, we could call this sort of the React ecosystem. Some other things that are in the ecosystem too, which sometimes can make React a little bit more difficult to learn, is the fact that you're dealing with, right off the bat, you're dealing with transpilation. It tends to get associated a lot with ES6. So that gives it a little bit of a more of a learning curve, I think, in terms of getting it under your belt. But again, it's not crazy complicated. So for instance, if we end up looking at this repo, and in fact, I ended up creating my sort of template repo from this repo. If we were to take a look at it, and this is stuff that we've pretty much seen before. We've got our standard Express application. We've got our body parser. We're using a JSON body parser because we're going to be sending data over the wire through Axios, which is going to basically be making XHR requests. And it makes more sense if you have a JavaScript object to send it as JSON data as opposed to the standard way forms end up sending data, which is URL encoded data. So we've got our body parser. We've just got a couple of static routes. We've got some other routes that we're bringing in here. And we've got some models as well. So if we go and take a look at our DB file, and again, in a real world application, we've seen this a bunch of times. And as you start to look at more complicated applications, in a minimum, this would be broken up into 4 files, right? We'd have one file for connection. We would have one file for our index, and we'd have files for each of our models. We could have other files really on top of that, but here, this is fairly simplistic. We're bringing in Sequelize. We're setting up our connection to our back end. This is basically just telling us that, hey, look, we're going to be creating models on the server that are going to be, we're going to end up pulling them from a database. Right? This is our object relational model. That's what Sequelize does. Sequelize says define your models, and I'll take care of all of your SQL for you. Right? So we don't end up writing any SQL. And here, bare bones, a user with a name, a product with a name, no validation, nothing all that complicated. We've got a sync task. We've got users and we've got products. And here, real simply, we've looked a bunch at promises. We're basically creating 3 promises for creating users, 3 promises for creating products, concatenating those 2 products together. We've got now an array of promises, and we say promise.all with all of the promises. Okay? Again, a lot of things that you've gotten introduced to, but the idea that not anything, but a lot of what happens asynchronously ends up getting done these days with promises. And so we could basically say, hey, look, here are the promises. When all these things are done, then we could end up doing something with our data that we end up inserting. We're just basically inserting the data. Having said that, we'll have our models, which is our user, our product, our sink, and our seed. Right? Fairly standard stuff for our back end. How do we expose that back end? Well, if it's an Express application, your models are going to end up getting exposed through your routes. We've got two really simplistic routes here. Users, find them all, order them by name. Products, find them all, order them by name. This allows us to create a product. This allows us to destroy a product, right? Again, things to sort of look out for as you start to develop these applications, you break these things apart. You're going to want to make sure that your routes are pretty lightweight, okay? We could almost think of our routes as being a little bit dumb, right? It's not our routes that are doing the work, it's our models that are doing the work. Turns out our models are not that complex either, but if there was complex logic that was going on there, that's where it would be within our models.
In terms of being light, you're doing the find all from here as opposed to creating a method on the thin model. Which one do you think?
There's no need, I really just want to find all. So there's no need to put it in the model. I mean, I guess the only thing that I could say is that if like my defaults were from find all, I had a bunch of different defaults, ordering by, things like that, then maybe I could put a class method on my model. Here, it's pretty light. I mean, you want to put class methods on your model when you're doing the same thing, over and over again. We're not really doing that here, so it's not all that necessary. But it's good.
I was accessing find all in some other method, and I was.
Then maybe, and you were using the order by, and you're saying, "Boy, this is getting annoying." So maybe you have to name it something else, right? Product, find all products, or something along those lines. If we, so this basically is a look at our back end, right? This is our back end, which is our routes. If we look at our index.html file, right, these are my instructions, but I think we could all basically say this is about as light as you could get, one div, and this is very common in terms of what a React application looks like, okay? We're using React, and as a result of using React, we want to be able to use JSX, because if we didn't use JSX, we would have a hard time generating our DOM. We could do it, but it would be a drag. So we're using Webpack, right? This is a pretty minimal configuration for Webpack. Really 3 entries, what it ends up coming down to. Our entry, our starting point, our output, where this thing is going to be going. And we want to use both React preset and we want to use ES 2015 preset. So those are being pulled in here through our loaders. Okay? I would almost say that this part of the application, in terms of being able to generate it, it's a good exercise. Sit down with nothing to start out with, create a model on the back end, okay? And I would think about the order for doing that would be do the model on the back end, right? See if you could actually seed some data. Once you have that, set up a couple of routes on your back end, okay? Once you have that, set up your front end. Go through that a few times. I mean, it really, in the end, it should, if you get proficient at it, it's maybe a half-hour exercise, if that much, okay? But once you have that set up, and again, that's basically a bar that you have with React. Again, there are tools that allow you to basically just say create React app, and it'll create the app. But I don't want you to get bogged down with that. I don't want you to think that there's a crazy amount of magic that's going on there. It's not all that magical. There might be some more bells and whistles than you see here, but not that many. When we start to go in and look at the source of our application, we know that this is our starting point, okay? So here's our app that we're bringing in here, and we're able to put in this JSX that says, hey, look, basically render this application on our route. And if we go in and break this down, we should be able to look at any of these files and really ascertain what's going on with our application. This by far probably is the most complicated one. This is really the smartest part of our application. When we end up creating this app, we're extending from component. This tells you that there's going to be a word this that's here. This is a smart component. If we look at it, there's a constructor which is setting up the state. I've got two different pages. I'm not using a router. We'll be able to solve this problem after tonight using a router, and we wouldn't have to go down this path. We'll also see that there's three methods here that we're binding to, because all of these methods are going to be affecting the state of our application. That's going to be the driver of our application. React knows to change things when the state ends up changing. So even if you were going to just go in here and take a look at this, you can see that we have this on-page change. We get a new page. We set the state. You can see that we have an on-create product. We have a product. We make a post to generate a new product. We basically concat this product on here, and we end up resetting the state. When we go to delete a product, this is very, I always forget the word that I want to use here. What's the word? Where you think you're thinking positively, you are optimistic, right? You're optimistic, you're saying, hey, look, I know I'm deleting this product. So you basically get a new collection of products. Again, nothing is going to change unless you set your state, okay? And then we make a call to the server so that that change is persistent.
Eric, that part there, can you handle it on the server instead of putting that array manipulation?
Well, you could. You could and you can't. I would be perfectly fine if what you did, it's a very, very good question. If what you did is you went to the server and you deleted the record, and after you deleted it, you made a call to get a list of the products. Totally fine with it. No problem with it whatsoever. But the bottom line is that if you want to see the user seeing those updated products, we know that we have to set, that's the key word, right? And again, if we wanted to, we could put all this stuff in one component, but we're going to have a pretty messy application. The state is going to be the brains for our application. It's operating inside this app component. Later on, we're going to move this logic for the state. We're going to end up moving it to what's called a Redux store to separate things out. That's going to be sort of the next step that we look at in this whole ecosystem. When we go to render, we can see, and again, here's some ES6 stuff, right? Again, as you're going through this, looking at some of this ES6, the whole idea here on line, let me see if I get a line number, line 42, right? The way that that reads is, look at the state and pull out from this object the page value, okay? You'll get used to it, okay? You don't have to do it this way. You could say const page equals this dot state dot page, but this saves you 4 characters, looks pretty, okay? And now you can just refer to this thing that's in the state just as page, okay? So you can see that here we've just got some conditional logic, okay? If our page is users, we're going to do the user list, right? And this is basically just going to be this state dot users. Frankly, I could have also grabbed users over here and gotten it from the state and passed this in here as well. And again, just keep in mind, I'm very defensive here, right? Defensive because by default, my state has an empty array. So even if someone was, even if I have code that's looping over this array, that's fine if it's an empty array, totally legitimate. But I want it to have some value so it doesn't end up blowing up, okay? So you can see that I've got these 2 different pages, one for a user list, one for a product list. Again, one thing that this tells us, as I always say, we want to be detectives here. One thing that this tells us is that Nothing all that interesting is happening inside of user list. How do I know? Not passing anything in there. Okay? Nothing really interesting is happening. But on product list, I'm going to pass in this on create product, okay, which is a function. And I'm also going to pass in on delete product. On top of that, I've also got my nav. And in my nav, I'm passing in some information. I'm passing in on page change. I'm passing in the actual page. I'm passing in the products. And I'm passing in the users as well. Might also make sense. Let me just pop this up here real fast to look at our app so we could just take a look at it and see it. Right, so this is actually not the right one. Oh, maybe that was the right one. So this is weekend assignment. This is the working site. So we've got our users and our products, and you could see, again, the way that I want you to think about these things from an engineering perspective when you're building them is look at what the functionality is. Look at what the functionality is and start circling things that feel like components of your application, right? We've got our nav bar. We've got our products list. We've got our user list. We can see our nav bar needs to know what page it's on, needs to know the number of users and the number of products. So I could do this, and this changes to 2. I could do this, and this goes back up to 3. Okay? And it also needs to know the number of products and the number of users as well. So if we go back and, again, take a look at the code and sort of drill down here, we could look, and all of these should be a little bit more simplistic. Okay? Here's our whole nav. We pass in what we need to pass in, very explicit. Okay? If you looked at this, you could ascertain what's going on with this component. We're passing in a page, we're passing in a function, we're passing in products, we're passing in a user. And we just do a little test. Hey, look, are we on the users page? If so, I'm going to make this active. On click, I'm going to call on page change it to users. On click, I'm going to call on page change and set it to products, right? I also want to show products.length and users.length. If we go back over here, that's our nav, right? Let's start out with the dumb one. Not much going on. This should be really, really short, okay? Our user list. Then again, I'm just using, I could pass an object to this and pull users out of this, but by doing this, I make this really, really dumb, okay? Whatever ends up getting passed here, and you could have multiple things passed here, I'm just interested in the user's property, and I'm going to loop over my users. I'm going to create a list item with the username, and I put in this key value so that React can better keep track of those items, okay? Again, you're starting out from scratch. You want to warm up like you're playing the piano with a React application. Put in some data, loop over it with an unordered list. Now, when we go into our product list, it's a little bit more complicated. We've got our products, we've got our onDelete product, we've got our onCreate product. On our product form, we're going to pass in onCreate product, so we have the ability to create a product. Again, we're passing things down, okay, so that we can call up to those functions, we can modify our database, and we can change our state, okay? We have our products that we're listing over. This is a product list item. We pass in on delete product. Again, if we go down and just take a look at that, here's our product list item. Could go in here and take a look at that. put a button on here, on click. We're passing it again. It's very explicit. If you look at this, there's no choice of global variables. Everything is passed in, and if it's passed in and it's not used, then what you pass it in there in the first place for, right? Everything that's passed in here should be used. Here's our product. We call on click, delete product, putting a little bit of a CSS class here. Again, this needs to be, this I want to end up getting rendered out as this object. That's why you see the double braces here. Because basically I'm saying that this style is this object, and this basically says I want you to render it as JavaScript, right? Anything between the braces is going to be JavaScript. So the only other one that we need to look at, and again, this is the, I don't think there's any really way to say it, that, forms in React are a lot more annoying than forms in other frameworks. And that's because forms inherently result in a change in a UI. And so React basically says, hey, how are you?
Hi.
React basically, I think I got everything there.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
And so React basically says, hey, look, if you're going to end up doing that, and you want to have your input, you want to handle your values, right? We could basically set this up and as a smarter component. So now we've got this product form. It's going to internally have its own state. On change name, we say on change name bind this. And here we're basically just saying, hey, look, whenever anyone ends up typing in this input form, we want to see that change. If you end up giving it a value and you don't do an on change, you'll never see your form value change. We'll do another example of this so that this makes a little bit more sense. Other than that, we've got our on clicked, which is basically this on create product, doing prevent default, I think because this is a form, and if I have a button inside of a form, it tries to submit the form. So I don't really want the form submitting. So I end up basically preventing that default. I look at these props that end up coming in here. Props, on create product, and I pass in the name, and then I set the state back, and that's what's causing this to, when I type in here, first of all, that changes, and then that ends up going back to an empty value. And that's about the extent of this workshop. But again, I mean, the key here is to sort of break this out into multiple components. Some are very short and dumber than other ones. Some, especially when you have forms, take a little bit more work. If something interesting is happening within any of these components, you're going to be passing some functions down there to say, hey, look, something interesting happened. I want to know about it. Alex, you had a question?
Yeah, I tried this and it worked in both cases. If I have, say, the concrete product in the button or in the form as on submit. So on click in the button versus on submit in the form. It worked the same.
Yeah.
I tried it. So like, why would you choose one?
I think what happens is that if you have a button within a form, I think the default behavior is that that button submits the form. So I think in essence, when you click on that button, there's an on submit event which ends up getting called. I think it ends up going to the same spot. Yeah, sometimes that can be a little bit confusing.
So you could have put either or there?
I mean, I just assume put a button in here. I mean, I don't know what it really buys me to do really an on submit. I say, hey, look, the button is getting clicked on, okay? This is what I want to have happen when the button gets clicked on.
You mean as opposed to close it, not having a button at all?
No, I guess you could have some, instead of having an on click, I guess you could put something on the form for on submit as well. But I think in the end, from the DOM's perspective, it takes you to the same spot. And I think in either case, the key here is that if you see you're doing a full form submission, then just realize that you want to basically make sure that you're not doing a full form submission because you want this to act as a single page application. If you end up looking in your console and you see you're doing a full post and getting a full page back, then you know you have an issue. Okay? Now, again, as we move into looking at React Router, what's the problem with this app? What do you see as a little bit of an issue? Yeah, I mean, well, one thing is there's no, if I went over here to products, or better case is users. If I went over here to users and I refresh the page, I always go back to products. Okay? So there's no bookmarking of the application. If I was to go over here and say, hey, look, Evan, this is a great page. Check it out. And I sent this to you, you'd say, hey, look, these users on here are amazing. And I send you the link, you say, hey, all I see is a bunch of products. Okay? So in other words, the URL is playing no role. Now, again, traditionally, the URL would determine what page ended up getting loaded. Okay? But with a single page application, we don't want to reload. Okay? We don't want a whole reload of our application. So that's where React Router comes in, and that's the next thing that we'll end up taking a look at. All right, let me stop this recording.